while pretty much everyone on the planet was busy stuffing stockings, burning the turkey, or arguing with relatives over the TV remote, NASA pulled off something that scientists had been calling flat-out impossible for generations. A small spacecraft, roughly the size of a family car, didn't just fly near the sun or close to the sun. It flew into it, straight into the sun's atmosphere, like it owned the place. Oh, and it was doing 430,000 miles per hour while it was at it, making it the single fastest human-made object in the entire history of our civilization. Let that sink in for a second. Every rocket, every bullet, every sports car you've ever heard of? Embarrassingly slow by comparison. At that speed, you could travel from New York to Los Angeles in roughly 20 seconds. That's not science fiction. That actually happened. And then, just as it disappeared behind the sun, silence. Total nerve-shredding silence. The team at Mission Control had absolutely no way of knowing whether their spacecraft was still alive, still intact, or had been vaporized into a cloud of very expensive dust. They just had to sit there and wait. No updates, no pings, no reassuring little beep, nothing. This is the story of how humanity literally reached out and touched a star, and what we discovered when we did. Stick around, because this one is genuinely mind-blowing. Why the corona is basically the most terrifying place in the solar system. Most people, if you ask them why the sun is dangerous, will shrug and say, well, it's hot, isn't it? And sure, they're not wrong. The surface of the sun burns at around 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That's already a temperature so extreme, it's almost impossible for the human brain to truly wrap itself around. Nothing in your everyday life comes remotely close. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets genuinely weird. The surface isn't even the dangerous part. The truly terrifying place is something called the corona. The corona is the sun's outer atmosphere. A massive, largely invisible envelope of superheated plasma that stretches millions upon millions of miles out into space in every direction. It's the glowing halo you can see around the sun during a solar eclipse, and it looks almost peaceful from a distance. It is anything but peaceful, because while the sun's surface sits at around 10,000 degrees Celsius, the corona reaches temperatures of somewhere between 1 and 3 million degrees Fahrenheit. That's up to 300 times hotter than the surface directly beneath it. Read that again. The atmosphere is 300 times hotter than the thing it's surrounding. If that doesn't make your brain stutter a little, I don't know what will. Think about it this way. If you stand next to a bonfire and then take a few steps back, it gets cooler. Obviously, that's just how heat works. Walk further away, feel less heat. It's one of the most fundamental, basic principles of thermodynamics. The kind of thing you learn in school and never think to question, because it's always true, except the sun completely ignores that rule. As you move away from the sun's surface and into the corona, the temperature doesn't drop. It absolutely rockets. Physicists have been scratching their heads over this for more than 80 years, calling it the coronal heating problem. It is, or at least was, one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in all of astrophysics. And honestly, the fact that the sun just casually breaks the laws of physics while we weren't looking is both humbling and slightly unsettling. But this isn't just a fun bit of pub trivia. It has real, serious consequences for life here on Earth, because it's from this corona that the solar wind is born. A relentless, never-ending torrent of charged particles blasting outward from the sun in every direction at speeds of between 200 and 500 miles per second. That stream of particles travels all the way to Earth, where it slams into our magnetic field. And when it hits hard enough, we're talking geomagnetic storms capable of knocking out satellites, scrambling GPS systems, disrupting radio communications across entire continents, and in the worst cases, overwhelming and collapsing entire power grids. So understanding the sun isn't just some nerdy academic hobby. It's about protecting the very infrastructure that keeps modern civilization running. The lights, the internet, the hospitals, the phones, all of it. If you've ever found this topic remotely interesting, drop a like on the video. It genuinely helps more people find content like this, the man whose name is on the spacecraft, and why that's a huge deal. Before we get to the mission itself, there's a story you absolutely need to hear. Because this spacecraft is named after a real person, and that almost never happens. NASA doesn't just go around slapping people's names on billion-dollar missions. So the fact that they did here tells you everything about how significant this moment was. Back in 1958, a young and somewhat audacious astrophysicist named Eugene Parker sat down and wrote a scientific paper with a fairly bold claim. He argued that the sun doesn't just sit there burning quietly. It constantly fires off a stream of charged particles that flows outward through the entire solar system in every direction, all the time. He called it the solar wind. When he submitted his paper to a leading physics journal, the editors sent it straight back. The peer reviewer, a well-respected, well-credentialed scientist, wrote that the paper contradicted established physics and flat out shouldn't be published. Can you imagine? You've just described one of the most important phenomena in the solar system, and some bloke with a red pen tells you you're wrong. Parker appealed. The journal eventually agreed to publish it, but only after the personal intervention of the editor-in-chief, Subrahmanyan Chandrasekhar, who would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Physics. Just 2 years later, actual spacecraft measurements confirmed that Parker had been absolutely, completely, 100% correct. The solar wind existed exactly as he had described it, almost to the letter. Over the following decades, Eugene Parker became one of the most towering figures in solar science. So when NASA was gearing up to launch a spacecraft directly into the sun's atmosphere, they decided to do something they had never once done in the agency's entire history. They named the spacecraft after a living person. Parker was 91 years old when it launched. He stood on the launch pad in Florida and watched his namesake rocket thunder into the sky. He passed away in 2022 at the age of 94, but not before he had lived long enough to see his spacecraft begin transforming our understanding of the very star he'd spent his whole life studying. That detail genuinely gets me every time. The man was told he was wrong. He pushed back. He turned out to be right. And then he got to watch a spacecraft carrying his name fly into the sun. If that's not a story worth sharing, I don't know what is. Go on. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. Engineering a machine that can actually survive. Inside a star, here's the engineering problem that kept some of the smartest physicists and aerospace engineers on the planet lying awake at night for literal decades. How on Earth, or off it, do you build a spacecraft that can not only enter the atmosphere of a star, but function inside it? Collect data? Send signals? Stay in one piece? The sun-facing surface of the Parker Solar Probe hits temperatures of around 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit during its closest passes. That's hotter than lava. Hot enough to melt steel, aluminum, titanium, pretty much any metal you'd normally consider building something important out of. And yet, and here's the part that sounds completely made up, the scientific instruments sitting just a few inches behind the heat shield operate at roughly 85 degrees Fahrenheit, room temperature, like a nice, comfortable office, separated from a 2,500-degree inferno by a shield that's only about 4.5 inches thick. The solution is one of the most elegant pieces of engineering NASA has ever produced. The heat shield, officially known as the Thermal Protection System, is built from 2 panels of carbon-carbon composite sandwiching a core of carbon foam. That foam is 97% air. It weighs almost nothing. It's extraordinarily strong, and it's one of the most effective thermal insulators ever launched into space. The sun-facing side is also coated in a special white paint that reflects the vast majority of incoming sunlight rather than soaking it up like a sponge. But here's the bit that really trips people up when they first hear it. The corona is 1,000,000 degrees. So how is the spacecraft not just instantly vaporized? The answer comes down to a distinction that sounds simple but is actually profound. Temperature and heat are not the same thing. Temperature tells you how fast individual particles are moving. Heat tells you how much energy those particles actually transfer when they bump into something. The corona is screaming hot in terms of particle speed, but it's also almost a perfect vacuum. There are almost no particles per cubic centimeter. So while each individual particle carries enormous energy, there are so few of them that the actual heat load delivered to the shield stays within manageable limits. The spacecraft isn't swimming through 1,000,000-degree bath. It's more like getting occasionally flicked by a very fast, very energetic, but very rare particle. A well-designed carbon shield can handle that, and NASA, to their immense credit, figured out exactly how. There was one more engineering headache that barely gets mentioned. At 430,000 miles per hour, the thermal forces trying to physically rip the spacecraft apart are absolutely immense. The engineer's solution? Flexible joints that allow the spacecraft's frame to flex and bend in response to those forces rather than resisting them rigidly and eventually snapping. The spacecraft was deliberately designed to bend so it wouldn't break. There's actually a really beautiful life lesson buried in there somewhere. 6 years of getting closer. The Venus Gravity Assist, explained Parker Solar Probe, launched in August 2018. But, and this is the part that surprises a lot of people, it didn't just point itself at the sun and floor it. It couldn't. The gravitational geometry of the solar system makes a direct approach essentially impossible. A spacecraft launched from Earth carries far too much orbital velocity and would simply overshoot, swinging off into a wider orbit rather than spiraling inward toward the sun. To solve this, NASA used a technique called a gravity assist, essentially using another planet's gravitational pull as a cosmic slingshot to redirect and slow the spacecraft down. And the planet they chose was Venus. Over 6 years, Parker Solar Probe flew past Venus 7 times. Each flyby used Venus's gravity to bleed off orbital speed, pulling the spacecraft's path tighter and tighter around the sun, like very slowly reeling in a fishing line from an enormous, incredibly hot fish. With each new orbit, the spacecraft reached a new record-breaking close approach before swinging back outward and then falling inward once more, closer than ever before. And during those 6 years of progressively tighter loops, the spacecraft wasn't just sightseeing. It was already making major discoveries. It found that the solar wind near the sun is far more tangled and turbulent than anyone had predicted. It detected strange, zigzagging reversals in the sun's magnetic field, structures that scientists started calling switchbacks, which appeared in far greater numbers than expected and seemed to play a crucial role in accelerating solar particles to remarkable speeds. It flew directly through enormous coronal mass ejections, those colossal explosions of solar plasma, and measured them from the inside for the very first time in history. The final Venus flyby happened in November 2024. After that, there was nothing left to do but plot a course for Christmas Eve and hold your breath. Christmas Eve, 2024, 36 hours of total silence. On the morning of December 24th, 2024, the team at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory in Maryland was not singing carols or opening advent calendars. They were sitting at their consoles, watching telemetry data scroll across their screens, waiting for their spacecraft to vanish. As Parker Solar Probe fell toward its closest approach, it entered what's called a communications blackout zone, a DIRI region so close to the sun that the sheer intensity of electromagnetic radiation from the corona completely drowns out any radio signal the spacecraft could possibly transmit. The team had known this was coming. They'd planned for it meticulously. They'd run the numbers 1,000 times, but knowing something intellectually and actually living through it are two very different things. At some point on that Christmas Eve, their spacecraft, a machine they'd spent more than a decade designing, building, testing, nursing, and worrying about through 6 years of increasingly close orbits, simply went silent. Completely, totally unreachable. No telemetry, no beacon, no comforting little status update, nothing. And there it was, 3.8 million miles from the surface of the sun, screaming along at 430,000 miles per hour, flying completely on autopilot through the atmosphere of a star, with no ability to receive new commands or send back a single byte of data, just doing its job, completely alone, in one of the most hostile environments in the entire solar system. For a bit of perspective, Mercury, the closest planet to the sun, a world of scorched rock and extreme temperatures, never gets within 28 million miles of the solar surface. Parker Solar Probe was more than 7 times closer to the sun than Mercury ever gets. Let that settle in. On the evening of December 26th, 2 days after closest approach, the Mission Operations Center finally received what every single person on that team had been desperately waiting for. A beacon tone. Just a simple radio signal, really. A basic status ping. But what it said, in essence, was, "I'm here. I'm operational. Everything is working normally." The room, by all accounts, absolutely erupted. Engineers who had given years of their careers to this mission were openly in tears. And honestly, good, they earned it. What Parker actually found inside the sun when the full science data began downloading to Earth in early January 2025, researchers finally had something completely unprecedented in human history: a detailed, close-up view of the sun's corona from the inside, not from a telescope pointed at it from millions of miles away, from within it. And the data immediately began answering questions that had been sitting open for decades. The spacecraft's WHISPER camera, the wide-field imager for Solar Probe, captured actual footage of the solar wind being born. You could literally see streams of charged plasma pulling away from the corona, accelerating outward, organizing themselves into the flowing structures that eventually sweep past Earth. Scientists described it as finally being able to watch a river at its very source after spending decades only ever studying it. Hundreds of miles downstream, the entire dynamic of how solar weather forms became visible in real time for the first time ever. The data also captured something that had only ever been predicted theoretically before, a phenomenon NASA scientists are calling the solar wind U-turn. When the sun launches a coronal mass ejection, one of those titanic explosions of magnetized plasma, not all of the material blasts off into space. Some of it actually loops back toward the sun, pulled in by the sun's own magnetic field, altering the corona as it does so and influencing the path and power of the next ejection. Parker Solar Probe filmed this up close, in detail no one had ever seen before. Understanding this feedback loop is huge for improving space weather forecasting because it helps explain why some solar storms hit like a freight train while others barely register. And then there's the big one, the coronal heating mystery. Preliminary data from the close approach is pointing strongly toward those switchbacks, those magnetic reversals, as one of the primary ways energy is transferred from the sun's surface up into the corona, heating it to those almost incomprehensible millions of degrees. It's not one single process, but a complex, beautiful interplay of magnetic reconnection events and turbulent wave activity. And Parker is giving scientists the resolution and the ringside seat they need to finally map it all properly. 80 years of mystery may be on the verge of an answer. That is absolutely wild. And if you're as gobsmacked by that as I am, smash that like button. It genuinely helps this kind of content reach more curious minds. Why this changes space. Weather forecasting. Possibly forever, Parker Solar Probe has continued making close approaches throughout 2025, each time matching its record distance of 3.8 million miles from the solar surface and its staggering record speed of 430,000 Mach. The Sun is currently near the peak of its 11-year activity cycle, which means solar storms are both more frequent and more intense than usual. And Parker is collecting data right in the thick of it, like a fearless journalist embedded in the middle of the action. But let's step back for a moment and talk about why this actually matters in practical, real-world terms. Because it's not just about satisfying scientific curiosity. Right now, every time a major solar storm is detected heading toward Earth, satellite operators get somewhere between 15 minutes and a few hours of warning. That's barely enough time to switch satellites into safe mode, let alone protect large-scale power infrastructure. It's the difference between a controlled shutdown and a chaotic failure. A sufficiently powerful solar storm, one on the scale of the famous 1859 Carrington event, which caused telegraph wires to spontaneously catch fire across Europe and North America, could today trigger cascading failures in power grids across entire continents. Some estimates suggest that the recovery could take months or even years at a financial cost that would dwarf almost any other natural disaster in recorded history. We're talking civilization-level disruption. The data that Parker Solar Probe is gathering at the source, watching how solar wind forms, how coronal mass ejections behave before they fully launch, how magnetic structures evolve in the moments before they're hurled outward. That data is the foundation for building genuinely reliable early warning systems, systems that could give us not 15 minutes of warning, but potentially days. That difference isn't just scientifically interesting. It could protect trillions of dollars of critical infrastructure and millions upon millions of people who depend on that infrastructure every single day without ever thinking about it. On December 24, 2024, a machine built by human hands flew into the atmosphere of a star. It survived temperatures that would vaporize any ordinary material. It moved faster than anything we have ever built. It went completely silent for 36 agonizing hours, and then it came back, carrying data that is already in the process of rewriting textbooks. For thousands of years, every culture that ever looked up at the sun treated it as something untouchable. A god, an unknowable mystery, a force so far beyond human reach that to even imagine touching it was the stuff of myth. Icarus flying too close and plummeting into the sea. NASA just flew closer anyway. And what Parker Solar Probe found inside the sun is not just going to change how we do science. It's going to change how well we can protect the civilization we've spent so long building together. If you made it this far, honestly, thank you. This is exactly the kind of content that deserves to be shared far and wide, and the only way that happens on YouTube is if you hit the like button and consider subscribing so you're here for the next one. Leave a comment below, I genuinely read them, and tell me, what part of this mission blows your mind the most? The engineering? The silence on Christmas Eve? The 80-year mystery potentially being solved? Let me know. Because next time, we're going to talk about what the James Webb Space Telescope found at the very edge of the observable universe. Something that, according to every model and every theory we had, simply should not exist. See you there.